Hi everyone, this is Ms. Dreesen. For today's notes, we will be focusing on learning targets 6 and 7, carbon-based organic compounds. This set of notes goes with essential question 3. What are the main types of carbon-based molecules, and why are they the building blocks of life? By the end of this set of notes, you should be able to describe the unique bonding properties of carbon atoms, relate them to their atomic structure, and explain carbon's significance in biomolecules. In learning target 7, you should be able to compare, model, and explain the structure and function of the 4 major types of organic compounds: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Let's start with a brief recap of what you learned in the learning target 1 through 4 notes. In the learning target 1 through 4 notes, you reviewed the structure of atoms, and you learned why is carbon such an important atom. Well, life as we know it is based on the carbon atom. Carbon forms the backbone of organic molecules that form living matter. Why is this? Well, carbon is a versatile element because it can form up to 4 bonds with other atoms. This makes it very unique among other elements because it can bond in virtually limitless ways with elements such as hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and other carbon atoms. This makes it very adaptable, flexible, and changeable. There are 4 major groups of organic compounds. Life as we know it needs these 4 types of organic molecules, including carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. For this set of notes, we highly recommend and ask that you use the provided template. You can also copy the basic structure of this template onto notebook paper or printer paper. You should also be using color pencils or color pens, and make sure that you're including the diagrams. We encourage you to draw your notes along with the video and pause and rewind as necessary. The first page of your notes should look like this. We're going to start in the upper left corner. So go ahead and zoom into the upper left corner for a brief review. If you were to look at the periodic table, you would see that the carbon element has the atomic number of 6. This is equal to the number of protons in the nucleus and the number of electrons that the carbon atom has. So let's draw that carbon atom as review. So if we were to draw the carbon atom, here's my C representing carbon. Our first orbital holds 2 electrons. Remember that carbon has 6 total electrons, so there are 4 remaining electrons. And these 4 remaining electrons fill half of the possible outer orbital here. So we essentially have space in this outer orbital for 1, 2, 3, 4 more bonds. So if we were to summarize, we have 4 unpaired, unpaired electrons, which means that this atom can form 4 covalent bonds. Okay, so that's just a recap of the important things we've learned. Now, these carbon atoms can bond to other things and form shapes of molecules. And some of the shapes we'll be learning about, we're going to briefly sketch over here. You don't have to sketch this if you don't want to, but it might be helpful. So there are a couple major types of shapes that we'll be looking at for molecules. We have chains, which is basically where we might have a couple of carbon atoms bonded in a row, and then there would be hydrogen atoms coming off. And you can see that the basic shape of this is a long chain of carbons and hydrogens. In comparison, we also have what we call branches or branched molecules. So this might be where, again, maybe we have a small chain of carbons, but then what if it branches off to form another chain of carbons? And off of each of these would be a hydrogen. I'm not going to write each of the hydrogens because that gets a little bit repetitive, but essentially you can imagine coming off of every one of those black lines would be a hydrogen atom. And lastly, we have what we call rings. So this is where we have, for example, carbons in a ring structure, which basically means just a closed shape. Not necessarily a circle, but a closed shape. And coming off of those carbons would again be any combination of hydrogens. Sometimes there's an HO, and then there's another H for another hydrogen, okay? Now what's important to note here is that when we're looking at pictures of carbon-based organic compounds, you will sometimes see that the carbons aren't labeled. Where, for example, if we were to draw that ring in another way, you might see it drawn like a pentagon. Or later you might see a hexagon. They don't always label each of the carbons because it gets too cumbersome to write them all. So just keep that in mind. Before we begin each of our major groups of organic compounds, I need to go through two terms with you: monomer and polymer. This refers to how many small building blocks are found within a molecule. The prefix mono means one. So this basically refers to a molecule that consists of one small building block. Okay, so again, mono means one. Now let's compare the word monomer to the word polymer. The prefix poly means many. So many monomers bonded together. Okay, so for each of these groups of organic compounds, we will be learning both the monomer form of that organic compound group and its polymer form. All right, let's dive into our carbohydrate group. The primary function of carbohydrate molecules is that they are used to store and release short-term energy. Okay, that's their primary function. They are used for short-term energy. In plants, carbohydrates also provide major structural support and protection for the organism. Let's dive into the monomer form of carbohydrates. The monomer of carbohydrates are called simple sugars. Sugar is the common name of a carbohydrate, by the way, so think of this as like donuts that you eat. And the scientific name for this would be monosaccharide. Monosaccharide. Remember that mono means one. Saccharide is a scientific term for sugar, so it's one sugar. And the important distinction here in terms of the structure of a monomer or a monosaccharide is that it's 1 to 2 rings of carbon. Okay, so for example, it might be, if it's one ring, it might be a pentagon. Remember that each intersection would be a carbon, and then branching off of that would be hydrogen atoms and oxygen atoms. And if we were to talk about a disaccharide, so this is the mono, and a di means two, and if we were to have two of them, it could perhaps be two hexagons bonded together. Do your best with these shapes. They don't need to be perfect so long as you can tell that they're basically rings of carbon. So again, each of these intersections would be a carbon with hydrogens just like branching off of it. Now, examples of molecules that you know of that are monosaccharides include glucose. For example, whenever you eat an apple, you are getting glucose. Sucrose is another example of a monosaccharide, as is fructose. So just to review, carbohydrates are also known as sugars. There are small building blocks of sugars called monosaccharides and disaccharides, which are 1 to 2 rings of carbon atoms bonded together. Now, a complex sugar would be your polysaccharide. So complex, meaning that it's just more than just two bonded together. So this would be your polysaccharide. So your complex sugar is a polysaccharide. This is basically 3 or more rings of carbon. So I'm not going to draw a really complex structure here. We're just basically going to draw 3 hexagons in a row. And then imagine there might be more. Now, examples of molecules that you eat that are classified as polysaccharides include starch, which is found in potatoes. Glycogen is one that you'll learn about, and cellulose is one that you'll find in plants. The elements that are found in carbohydrates include carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And when we talk about elements, remember that we're talking about CHNOPs, okay? And the three CHNOPs elements found in your carbohydrates are CHO. Again, we've talked about the structure of the monosaccharide and polysaccharide being rings of carbon. So for structure here, you could write rings. You'll eventually find that some polysaccharides might be many rings in branches. So you could write rings and branched or branches of rings. Okay, so that is carbohydrates in a nutshell. Let's dive into the next group, which is lipids. So lipids are used to store energy long term. So similar to the carbohydrates, they're both used to store energy, but carbohydrates are for quick energy release and lipids are for long-term energy storage. Lipids are used by molecules to form cell membranes. So when you think about the outer structure, you don't have to draw this, but think about the outer structure of a cell. That's a really weird cell. Imagine this is a cell. That outer barrier of that cell is made up of a membrane. Lipids also form waterproof coverings. Lipids are used by organisms as molecules called hormones. You probably know of a couple of types of hormones, including estrogen and testosterone. And last but not least, lipids are not soluble in water. This means that they're not dissolvable. Once we go through some examples of lipids, you'll understand what that means in terms of they're not dissolvable in water. So if we were to look at the monomer structure of a lipid, this is called a fatty acid. So a fatty acid is the monomer form of a lipid. You can see that we have a long chain of carbons. So this is essentially 1 to 2 chains of carbon. And branching off of a fatty acid will be a region of this molecule called a carboxyl group. So if you're using the provided template, I want you to put like a little shape around that and label it carboxyl. You don't need to memorize that right now. You just need to be able to recognize it. And we'll be practicing identifying that carboxyl group over the next couple of days. The polymer form of our lipids is the lipid themselves, lipids. Okay, so fatty acid is one, lipids are many fatty acids bonded together. So when we take a look here, you can see, for example, you can see that there's this jagged line. This jagged line is basically carbon after carbon atom in this long branched chain. But remember that because there's so many carbons, it's not easy to write all of those carbons. So sometimes organic chemists will just draw lines to represent where each line bonds together would be where a carbon is. And off of each of those carbons would be a hydrogen atom as well. So you can see we have 1, 2, 3 fatty acids bonded here together. And they're bonded with this major group here. And this major group right here I want you to label is called a glycerol. So Glycerol, glycerol. You could even like draw the same color shape around that group. So a glycerol can sometimes be used to bond many fatty acid lipids together into a larger structure. So a polymer form of our lipid is essentially 3 or more branched chains of carbon. If we were to talk about some examples of foods that you eat that contains lipids, remember how I mentioned that these are molecules that don't dissolve in water? So think about when you're cooking or when you're cleaning dishes. If you're adding water to something, what usually bounces off? You might think of oils and fats. So examples of fatty acids and lipids that in the food that we eat include oils, like olive oil or vegetable oil. We also have animal fat, including the fat in our bodies. Wax is a type of lipid. And when we eventually learn about the structure of the cell membrane, we will learn about phospholipids. lipids. Okay, so these are lipids that contain phosphorus, and we'll learn more about those next unit. The elements that we find from CHNOPS in our lipids include carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus, CHOP. If we were to summarize the shapes of our lipids, again, we have chains of carbon, and sometimes many of those chains get bonded together to form branched chains. All right, so we just learned about carbohydrates and lipids. To recap and review them, remember that both are used for energy. However, carbs are your sugars, they're for short-term energy release, and your lipids are your fats. Those are for long-term energy storage. On the next side of our notes, we are going to be learning about proteins and nucleic acids. All right, let's dive in and learn about proteins. Proteins are really variable and diverse molecules. They have lots of different jobs inside of the cells of organisms. One of their major functions is to control the rate at which chemical reactions happen. And the special types of proteins that do this are called enzymes. We'll be learning a lot about enzymes later on in this week and through next week. Proteins also help regulate or control cell processes. They form important structures inside of cells. They transport molecules or substances in and out of cells. They play a role in the communication of cells among other cells in an organism. And as I mentioned, they are the most diverse group of molecules, meaning they have the most jobs of any other type of molecules. Now, what's important to focus on here that we need to add, many of our students get confused with carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, and they think that because of what they've learned perhaps in health classes or in social media, they think that proteins are used for energy. And that is not true. In what we're going to be learning about in this class, proteins are not used as a major source of energy. Now, for our athletes and our bodybuilders, it is still really important to consume lots of protein because when you're using your body and you're breaking and tearing muscle, proteins play a really important role in building muscle cells. So they again are used for, we use them to form cell structures and build muscle, but they are not used as a major source of energy. So make sure you know that. All right, let's dive into the monomer structure of our proteins. The monomer of a protein is called an amino acid. Sometimes we label this AA for short. Okay, so amino acids are the monomers. And there are many different types of amino acids. There's actually 20 different types of amino acids. And they have a similar layout, a similar structure. And let's take a look at this structure. On one side of this amino acid, so imagine this whole shape right here. Let's label this our amino acid. Now, a small part of this amino acid is right here, NH2. Sometimes it's NH3. This is what we call an amine group. Think about the N in amine referring to the N here. So this is our amine group. And we also have a group that you might recognize from before, the COOH. This is our carboxyl group. Carboxyl group. And you might notice this R. This R is what is different between the 20 different types of amino acids. So this R group is replaced. Think of R as being replaced among the 20 types of amino acids. So in our lab that you'll be working on Tuesday and Wednesday, you will learn that that R group is different or changes in between different types of our amino acids. Now, these amino acids can bond together and form really long chains. So imagine we took this amino amino acid, and we zoomed out and drew it as just a small circle. If we were to bond that small circle to another amino acid and then to another amino acid and so on and so forth in these long complex chains of the 20 different types of amino acids, this is what forms what we call our protein. The specific type of bond between each amino acid is called a peptide bond, which is why another word for protein is a polypeptide. Remember that poly means many, peptide referring to bonds. So a protein is the same thing as a polypeptide. It's many amino acids bonded together in a long chain held together by peptide bonds. And every type of protein has a very unique chain of these amino acids. So imagine you had 20 different types of building blocks or 20 different types of Legos. And imagine you had an infinite supply of each of those 20 types. Think of all of the different things you could build. That's the same idea here with our amino acids. We have 20 different building blocks, and you can create a large diversity of different types of proteins. The elements that we find in our proteins is CH, so carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, remember that amine group. We have lots of oxygen and sulfur. Sulfur is a unique element to our proteins out of all of the other types of organic compound groups we'll be learning about. The basic structure here is branched chains. So just to recap, we've learned about proteins. Proteins are the most diverse group of organic compounds out of the other three we'll be learning about. They have very important jobs inside of cells, and they are not used as a major source of energy, but they are involved in the building of cells and regulating cell processes. Now let's dive into nucleic acids. You've actually probably heard of nucleic acids before, even if you don't recognize the name nucleic acid. Nucleic acids are molecules that store and transmit hereditary or genetic information. Your nucleic acids provide an instruction manual for how your cells are supposed to work and do their jobs. There are two types of nucleic acids. DNA, which is the one you've probably heard of before, the DNA inside of your cells. And we'll also be learning about RNA, which is a close relative of DNA. Let's take a look at the structure of our monomer of a nucleic acid. The monomer of a nucleic acid is a nucleotide. Do you notice the prefix nucle is similar to nucleic acid? You need to use that as a clue if I were to ask you what is the monomer of a nucleic acid. So there are three smaller parts of a nucleotide. This circle part of the nucleotide is what we call the phosphate group. Okay, so that's the phosphate group. So you could even write a P on the inside. The pentagon, what have we learned are our closed rings of carbons. Hopefully you remember that that's a sugar. So this would be a sugar inside of our nucleotide, a 5-carbon sugar. And last but not least is a rectangle shape that we use to represent the nitrogen base, meaning that there would be nitrogens inside of that part of the molecule. There are 5 different nucleotides. There are 5 different nucleotides that vary based on so they vary because of their sugar. There are 2 different types of sugars, and they vary based on their nitrogen base. We will learn more about those 5 different nucleotides in future units, but for now just focus on the basic shape of a nucleotide and that it is a monomer of a nucleic acid. The polymer, therefore, is our nucleic acids. This is essentially many nucleotides linked together in a long chain. Many nucleotides in a chain. For example, if I were to draw one nucleotide, we have the phosphate bonded to the 5-carbon sugar, bonded to the nitrogen rectangle. That could be bonded in a long chain connected at the bottom of the sugar to another phosphate, sugar, base. Again, another bond comes off of the bottom of the sugar, phosphate, sugar, base. Okay, so this is an example of one, if we were to summarize that, that's one chain of nucleotides. That is our RNA nucleic acid, our RNA. If we were to do two of those chains connected together, for example, if we did this times 2, hopefully you recognize that double helix structure as being our DNA shape. The elements that we find inside of our nucleic acids include carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and the unique one is phosphorus. Because remember that phosphate group that you see here, this is our phosphate group, so that's where the phosphorus comes from. The structure would be branched. You could also say that it's branched chains. So to recap, we have learned that nucleic acids store and transmit hereditary or genetic information. This would be your DNA. Remember that you inherit your DNA from your biological parents, and that tells your cells how to do their jobs and how to make you the unique person that you are. There are two types of nucleic acids, that's DNA and RNA. Nucleic acids are built of nucleotides, which includes a phosphate, sugar, and nitrogen base. We really encourage you to practice these terms by redrawing these notes a couple of times. You might think it's cumbersome, but by redrawing these notes a couple of times, it will actually help you remember faster and more efficiently than using other methods. We have also created a really detailed Quizlet set for you to use to practice. If you have any questions, we encourage you to attend our office hours or to send us a message on Schoology. Thank you for watching, and we hope this was helpful.